I never saw it coming. That's what people always say in situations like this, and I get it now. They mean they didn't anticipate the betrayal, the cold words, the moment when someone you raised and loved looks at you with barely concealed contempt. I wasn't an absent father. I was there for school plays, soccer games, scraped knees, homework crises. I stayed involved, stayed present, stayed the kind of man who shows up. But somewhere along the way, my relationship with my son had deteriorated without me fully realizing how bad things had gotten. I was about to find out just how much he resented me, how deeply the family wounds had cut. This isn't a story about a kid who didn't understand his father. This is a story about what happens when a father finally understands his son and realizes that person isn't who he thought he was raising all those years. My son called me on a Tuesday afternoon. His name is David. He's 32 now, and he usually doesn't call unless he needs something. I've never been good at saying no to him. That's probably part of how we ended up here. He was excited on the phone, almost giddy in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Dad, can you come over tonight? I want to talk to you about something big." I could hear that tremor in his voice that means life-changing news. "Sure, buddy. 7 o'clock?" I spent the rest of the afternoon at work distracted, checking my watch, imagining scenarios. Maybe he was getting married to Rachel, his girlfriend of 3 years. Maybe a promotion or a house. My relationship with David had been strained, and good news felt like a chance to reconnect, to bridge the gap that had opened between us. I got to his apartment at 7. Rachel was there too, sitting on the couch with a nervous smile. They'd clearly prepared for this conversation. "Hey Dad," David said, "come sit down. Rachel and I want to tell you our news." The diamond on Rachel's left hand made it clear. They were getting married. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. "When's the wedding?" They exchanged a glance. "That's what we want to talk about," Rachel said softly. "Sometime next year. We want a nice venue, probably 100 people or so." I nodded. I'd love to be part of the planning. That's when David's entire demeanour shifted. His jaw tightened, and suddenly he wasn't my son anymore. He was someone harder and colder. "Actually, Dad, that's why we wanted to talk to you," David said, his voice dropping into a register full of resentment. "Rachel and I have made decisions about the wedding, and we want to be up front. We don't want you involved in the planning, at all. We've decided on the details with Rachel's parents. It's 120 people, fairly exclusive." I felt unease, but said nothing. "Okay," I managed. "What about my role?" David's expression hardened. "That's the thing. You're not paying for anything. Not the venue, not the catering, nothing. Rachel's parents are covering it. Around $98,000 total." My face got hot. It wasn't about the money. It was about the exclusion. About being shut out of something important. "David, what about—" He paused. That pause was longer than any pause should ever be. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Dad, you don't get invited to the wedding. You're not paying for anything." He said it flatly, like he'd rehearsed it, like he'd been waiting a long time to say this to me. I stared at him. I actually stared at him like I'd never seen him before in my life, because I hadn't seen this version of him. This wasn't the boy I'd raised. This wasn't even the angry teenager I'd dealt with during his rebellious phase. This was something colder, something more calculated. Rachel was watching me with an expression of pity mixed with satisfaction, which somehow made it worse. She wanted this, I realized. She'd pushed for this. She wanted my son to cut me out, and he'd agreed. He'd done it willingly. I opened my mouth to ask questions, to defend myself, to demand some kind of explanation that made sense, but nothing came out. I just sat there on their couch, feeling the weight of years of subtle rejections and distance suddenly crystallize into something concrete and undeniable. My son had just uninvited me from his wedding, not because of anything I'd done in the moment, but because of something deeper, some accumulation of grievances I hadn't even known about. "I'm sorry, what?" I finally managed. My voice sounded small. "You heard me," David said. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't angry even. He was simply stating facts the way you describe a weather pattern. "Rachel and I decided that we wanted the wedding to be about us, not about you. We don't want you there. We don't want your money. We don't want your opinions on centerpieces or the color of the napkins or anything else. We just want you to not be involved." The thing that got me, the thing that really got me, was how calm he was. If he'd been raging, if he'd been screaming at me about everything I'd done wrong as a father, At least there would have been passion there. At least it would have meant he cared enough to be angry. But this was clinical. This was a decision made in advance, discussed and refined until it came out smooth as glass. I just smiled. That's what I did in that moment. I didn't argue or beg or try to figure out what I'd done wrong. I just smiled. It was the kind of smile you give when you're pretending to understand something you don't, when you're buying time while your mind races. I stood up, and I remember looking at David's face, really looking at it, trying to see if there was any doubt there, any trace of the kid I'd known. There wasn't. "Okay," I said. "Well, I think I'm going to head home." I walked to the door, and neither of them tried to stop me. Rachel called out something polite as I left, some platitude about understanding my feelings, and I just raised my hand in acknowledgement without turning around. I drove home in a daze. The radio was playing something cheerful, and it felt obscene. I too reeled it off and drove in silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. By the time I got home, I still didn't understand. I knew there had been distance between us. I knew he resented me, or at least I knew now that he did. But this level of rejection was almost incomprehensible. I kept replaying the conversation, looking for the moment where I should have responded differently, where I could have changed the trajectory of the evening. But there was no such moment. He'd walked into that conversation with his decision already made. I was an afterthought, someone to be managed and dispatched. I sat in my kitchen that night in the dark, thinking about calling him, demanding an explanation, trying to fix things. But I thought about the look on his face when he said those words. I thought about the satisfaction in Rachel's eyes. They prepared for this conversation, which meant David knew what he was doing would hurt me. He'd done it anyway, so I didn't call, I didn't reach out. And then it came to me. Not as anger, but as clarity. My son had made his choice, and now I was going to make mine. I had access to something he wanted, something he needed. For the first time in my life, I was going to use that access as leverage. Not for love, not to fix our relationship, but because he'd humiliated me. Because he'd looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome, and then expected me to accept it. So I didn't. I waited until the next morning, and then I made a phone call of my own. The next day I called the Grand View, the upscale hotel ballroom where they'd booked the wedding. I got Patricia, the events coordinator. "I'm calling about the Bennett wedding," I said. "I need to understand the payment structure. Who exactly is the account holder?" She hesitated. "Well, the initial deposit came from Rachel's parents, but the contract is under their names and your son's name, David Bennett, with Rachel Chen listed as the bride." David's name was on the contract, crucial. "And the payment schedule?" I asked. "We've received 25% down, that's $24,500. The rest is due in 3 installments, with the final payment about $37,000, due 1 week before the event." I thanked her and hung up. I called my bank and asked about the wedding fund I'd started years ago. It had been growing quietly, meant as a gift for David. I had $240,000 in that account. It was meant to be a blessing, a financial cushion for his married life. I'd set up the account with significant authority over it. I could move money, redirect transfers, place holds on transactions. It wasn't a weapon exactly, but it could be one if I decided to use it. I sat looking at the numbers on my screen and thought about what David had done to me. Years of being a present father, sacrificing time and energy and money for his future, and how he'd repaid me with humiliation. That final statement, "You're not paying for anything." Well, I thought, we'll see about that, but I didn't act immediately. I wasn't that kind of man, not ordinarily anyway. I waited, I watched, and over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. David called me once, briefly, to tell me about some detail of the wedding preparations. He sounded almost normal, almost like he was reaching out, and for a second I wondered if maybe he'd regretted what he'd said. But then he mentioned something about how nice it would be to have a wedding without the drama that sometimes comes from the groom's family, and I understood. He wasn't reaching out, he was just checking in to confirm that I was staying away, that I was accepting my exile. There were no apologies. There was no acknowledgement that what he'd done might have been harsh or hurtful. There was just the ongoing assumption that I would accept his terms, that I would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he threw my way, and that I certainly wouldn't step out of line by demanding better. The planning continued without me. David and Rachel would send out updates to the family. I got them too, but they felt like they were addressed to someone else, like I was on a mailing list rather than being actively informed. They showed pictures of dress selections, arrangements of flowers, samples of cake designs. Rachel's parents were apparently heavily involved, making decisions and offering input, being treated like full members of the wedding party, while I was treated like a problem that had been successfully neutralized. I watched all this happen and felt the weight of it, the complete and total exclusion from something that should have been a family milestone. But I also felt something else, something colder and sharper. I felt the slow burn of anger transforming into something more strategic. I stopped looking at my son as my son. I started looking at him as someone who had made a calculated decision to hurt me, and I started thinking like the man I used to be before I became a father, before I became someone who prioritized family above all else. 2 months before the wedding, David called me. His voice was different. There was tension in it, and underneath that tension, I could hear something else. Anxiety, maybe, or fear. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you about something." I waited. I let the silence stretch out. He continued. "Look, things with Rachel have been stressful. Wedding planning is harder than I thought." I said nothing. "And my work situation has changed. The promotion I was expecting didn't come through. And Rachel's dad has had some health issues that are making things complicated with his business." Still nothing. "What I'm trying to say is, we're going to need your help. We need you to cover some of the wedding costs. Just some of it. We don't need everything, just maybe the—" "David," I interrupted, "you told me I'm not paying for anything. You were very clear about that. Do you remember?" There was a long pause. "Dad, I was angry. I didn't mean—" "You said I don't get invited. You said Rachel's parents are covering everything. You said you didn't want me involved. You remember that, right?" Another pause. "Yeah, but nothing," I said calmly. "You made your position clear. You don't need my money. You don't need me involved. You've got Rachel's parents. That's what you wanted, so that's what you've got. I'm not changing my plans based on your change of heart." He tried again, his voice getting softer, almost pleading. "Dad, please. I understand that I was harsh, but we need help. If you could just—" I hung up. After that call, something shifted inside me. It was like a door that had been cracked open suddenly slammed shut. I wasn't angry anymore. I was past anger. I was into something colder, something more definitive. I spent time that evening setting things in motion. I called my bank. I spoke to the same banker I'd talked to before, and I explained that I wanted to restructure the wedding fund. I explained that I was concerned about fraud, that I was worried my name might have been used without authorization, that I wanted to put protective measures in place. It took a few conversations with different people in the fraud and security department, but eventually I got what I needed. I had them place a hold on the account pending verification of certain transactions. I made it complicated. I made it seem legitimate. I made it so that while my name remained on the account, no funds could be accessed without my explicit written authorization, which I controlled completely. I then called the Grandview Hotel and I spoke to Patricia again. I explained that as the named account, holder of record for the wedding fund that had been set aside, I had concerns about who exactly was accessing that money. I asked her to verify the payment methods on file. She was confused, but she was also professional. She told me that Rachel's parents had been making the payments via wire transfer. I thanked her and let her know I'd be in touch about revisions to our arrangement. Then I made one final call to my lawyer. The conversation with my lawyer was brief. I outlined the situation. I explained my concerns. I explained what I wanted to do. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Susan who'd handled my divorce 15 years ago, listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. "You understand this is going to be nuclear," she finally said. "Yes," I said. "I understand that completely." "And you're prepared for the fallout?" "I am." She took a deep breath. "Okay, here's what we can do. Legally, you have several options based on the account structure and your role as custodian and partial owner of the wedding fund. The cleanest way would be through what's called a stop payment order, combined with a fraud investigation hold. It would take some paperwork, but it's absolutely within your rights. We discussed the specifics. We discussed the risks. We discussed what would happen if David sued me, if he contested it, if this went to court. He won't want to go to court, I said, because any court would look at the circumstances and see that he explicitly told me I'm not paying for anything, that I'm not involved, that he doesn't want my money or my participation. So he can't claim I breached a promise, and he can't prove I did anything illegal. Susan smiled slightly. "You've thought about this." "I have," I said. It was true. I'd thought about nothing else for weeks. So on the Thursday evening before the wedding was set to happen that Saturday, I sent the instruction to my bank. I sent them written authorization on my letterhead, stating that due to suspected fraud and unauthorized access attempts to the wedding fund account, I was placing an immediate hold on all pending transactions and requesting an investigation. I then called Patricia at the Grandview and told her the same thing. I told her there had been unauthorized activity and that no further payments should be processed until I'd personally verified them. Patricia was alarmed. "But the wedding is in 2 days," she said. "I understand," I replied, "but my attorney has advised me that we need to handle this properly. I'm sure we can sort it out quickly once the investigation is completed." Then I waited. I sat at home on Friday evening, knowing that David and Rachel's parents would eventually realize what had happened. I knew they'd be panicking. I knew they'd be trying to figure out what went wrong. I knew they'd eventually realize it was me. I knew this because I wanted them to know. I wanted David to understand what it felt like to be excluded, to be helpless, to have something important taken away by someone who was supposed to care about you. The call came at 10:15 in the morning on Friday. It wasn't from David. It was from Patricia, and her voice was panicked. "I have a very serious situation," she said. "The wire transfer we attempted this morning was rejected. But more than that, I've been informed that the wedding fund account has been frozen pending a fraud investigation. The entire account is inaccessible. This is for a wedding that's supposed to happen tomorrow." I maintained a calm voice. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Patricia. As I mentioned, there have been concerns about the account. I'm sure we can resolve this." "Resolve this?" she said. "The non-refundable deposit that was paid is being retained. The venue is cancelled. I don't understand what's happening here, but you need to fix this immediately." I thanked her and hung up, and then I waited for David to call. He didn't call. Rachel called. Rachel's parents called. They called repeatedly, and I didn't answer. The text started flooding in. Frantic messages about what was happening, demands that I explain, pleas that I fix it. I ignored all of them. Then, finally around noon, David's name appeared on my phone screen. I answered on the first ring. "Hello, David." His voice was barely recognizable. It was panicked, desperate. Nothing like the cold certainty he'd had when he told me I wasn't invited to his own wedding. "Dad, what is happening? They're saying the venue is cancelled. They're saying there's a hold on the money. What did you do?" I was quiet for a moment. "I did what you told me to do," I said. "You told me I'm not paying for anything. You told me I'm not involved. You told me I'm not invited. So I took those instructions to heart. I made sure you don't need my money, that I'm not involved, and that your wedding can proceed without me. You should be happy, David. You got exactly what you asked for." He was sputtering, incoherent. "Dad, you can't just... This is insane. You have to undo this. You have to call them and tell them to process the payments. The wedding is tomorrow. Our guests are coming. Rachel's in tears. We can't cancel this." His voice cracked on the last part. "Can't cancel it," I said calmly. "David, you're the one who uninvited me. You're the one who said you didn't need my money. You're the one who made your choice. I just helped you stick to it." He was trying to say something else, but I heard the other voices in the background, the sounds of complete chaos, and I hung up. They showed up at my house at 2 in the afternoon. David, Rachel's parents, and an older couple I assumed were David's paternal grandparents. They were all standing on my porch when I opened the door. David looked like he hadn't slept in days. Rachel was red-eyed from crying. Her parents looked furious. "You need to come with us," David's father-in-law started, but I held up a hand. "No, I don't, but you all need to come in." I stepped aside and let them into my living room. The silence was suffocating. "Explain," I said simply. It was David who spoke first, his voice broken. "Dad, please, I know I said things that hurt you. I know I was cruel, but this isn't the answer. You can't sabotage my wedding because you're angry with me." I looked at him for a long moment. "David, I'm not angry. I'm not even sad anymore. I'm just done. You had your chance to be my son, to treat me with basic respect, to acknowledge that I was there for you your entire life. You chose not to, and now you're here begging me to save your wedding. And do you know what the irony is? You're only here because you need something from me. Not because you want me there, not because you realized you were wrong, but because you need my money. If this had gone smoothly, if everything had gone according to your plan, you would be married tomorrow without ever thinking of me again. Well, congratulations. You're thinking of me now." Rachel started crying harder. Her mother put an arm around her. David's grandfather stepped forward. "Young man," he said to me, "whatever your son did, you're hurting your granddaughter-in-law here. That's not right." I looked at Rachel. I actually felt a twinge of sympathy for her. She'd been caught up in David's bitterness toward me, but she was a victim of this too. "I'm sorry, Rachel," I said, and I meant it. "This is between your fiancé and me, but I'll make you an offer." They all looked up. "David can come back here, alone, just him. He can apologize. He can explain what he meant when he said I wasn't invited to his wedding. He can explain what he meant when he said I'm not paying for anything, and then we can talk about what happens next with the money." Rachel's eyes went to David. His entire body had gone rigid. "Dad," he whispered, "I can't do that right now. Can't you see everyone's here? Can't we just talk about this privately later?" I felt something harden inside me. Even now, even with everything on the line, he couldn't bring himself to humiliate himself in front of other people, just to ask his father for help. Even now, his pride was more important than his wedding. "There is no later," I said quietly. "You had your chance. You're still having your chance. But if you won't take it, then I guess your wedding isn't happening." And I opened the door and I looked directly at him. "So what's it going to be, David? Are you going to stand up and be a man? Or are you going to walk out of here and explain to all those guests arriving tomorrow why they're not getting married?" David's mouth opened and closed several times. I could see the war playing out behind his eyes, this internal battle between pride and desperation, between the need to maintain his image and the desperate knowledge that his entire world was falling apart. His shame at having to ask his father for help in front of all these people, in front of Rachel's parents who he'd worked so hard to impress, was written all over his face. I watched him calculate the odds, watched him try to figure out if there was any way to salvage this without completely humbling himself in this room, and I could see the exact moment he realized there wasn't. That moment was extraordinary. I watched my son choose reality over fiction. "Everybody," David said quietly, his voice cracking slightly, "can you give me and my dad a minute?" Rachel made a move to stay with him, but he held up his hand in a gesture that looked almost desperate. "Just us, please." Rachel's mother started to object, opening her mouth to say something about how they were family and should handle this together, but Rachel herself pulled at her sleeve. She'd seen something in David's face, some signal that only a wife would recognize, and she made the choice to respect his boundary. They filed out of my living room like mourners leaving a funeral, which I suppose in some way this was. The funeral of David's wedding, at least as he'd planned it. The funeral of his version of himself, the man who didn't need his father, the man who was completely self-sufficient, the man who was too proud or too angry to ever ask for help. When they were gone, David sat down on my couch without being invited. He didn't seem to notice that he'd sat without asking. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow, like the weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours had physically compressed him. Maybe it was just the fluorescent lighting in my living room casting harsh shadows across his features. Maybe it was because I was finally seeing him clearly for the first time in years, without the filter of parental love softening the edges of his character, without the hope that he'd eventually come around. Maybe I was just seeing him as he really was, a man struggling under the weight of his own choices. "I'm sorry," he said, just like that. 2 words. 2 words that didn't come close to covering the territory of what had passed between us. 2 words that felt both insufficient and somehow more honest than any long explanation could have been. "Sorry for what exactly?" I asked. I wasn't trying to be cruel in that moment. I was trying to understand what he was actually apologizing for. Was he sorry for what he'd done? For uninviting me? For excluding me? Or was he sorry he'd gotten caught? Sorry that his plan to freeze me out had backfired so spectacularly? There's a difference. There's a profound difference between being sorry for your actions and being sorry that your actions had consequences. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him do 1,000 times when he was overwhelmed or upset. "For all of it," he said. "For the things I said. For the way I treated you. For excluding you. For the horrible way I told you that you weren't invited. For making you feel like you didn't matter to me." He looked up at me, and his eyes were wet with tears he was actively fighting against. "You do matter, Dad. You've always mattered. I was just so angry about things that have nothing to do with you, and I took it out on you, and I've been taking it out on you for years, probably, and I didn't even realize how much it was building up until I finally exploded at you that night in my apartment. It was like everything I'd been storing up just came out in one horrible rush, and I couldn't stop it. I didn't say anything immediately. I let that confession sit between us like a third person in the room. I thought about all the slights, all the times he'd made excuses not to visit when Margaret was alive and wanted to see him. All the times he'd called me late at night sounding drunk and angry. All the times he'd made passive-aggressive comments about my life choices, my relationship with his mother, my relationship with Rachel, the way I'd supposedly tried to control him when all I'd been doing was trying to stay involved in his life like a father is supposed to do. "What were you angry about?" I asked. The question hung in the air. David was quiet for a very long time, and I let him sit with it. I didn't fill the silence or suggest answers. I waited for him to find the truth on his own. "I don't know," he finally said. "Everything. Nothing. Maybe I was angry that you and Mum got divorced when I was 14, right in the middle of the most confusing years of my life. Maybe I was angry that you seemed to move on so easily while I was still struggling with it for years. Maybe I was angry that you always seemed to know what to say and do in difficult situations, and I never did. I felt like I was failing at everything, and I resented that you made it look so easy. Maybe I was angry that Rachel thought I should set boundaries with you, that I should prove I was my own man, that I should show I didn't need you, and I let her convince me that the way to do that was to hurt you. I let her words poison the well between us." He looked at me again, and there was something raw and honest in his expression. "I've been so miserable, Dad. The business is failing. Rachel and I have been fighting constantly about money, about the future, about whether we should even be getting married. Her parents have been pushing us to have this wedding that we can't afford, and they're making it clear that it matters to them whether we have the kind of celebration they think we should have. And instead of dealing with any of that like an adult would, I just made it all about you. I made you into the villain, made you into the problem, so I didn't have to look at my own failures." Something shifted in me when he said that. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. And understanding is sometimes more important than forgiveness, because it bridges the gap between anger and compassion. I realized I was looking at my son, not at the version of my son I'd constructed in my mind. "You're still young," I said. "You have time to fix this, to fix the business, to figure out what you want with Rachel, to build something real instead of something that looks good on the surface and is hollow underneath." David shook his head slowly, and there was such defeat in the gesture. "I don't deserve your help. Not after what I did to you. Not after the way I treated you." That's when I realized something that changed everything. That's when the gravity of what I'd done, what I'd set in motion, suddenly crashed down on me. All this time I'd been so focused on punishing him, on making him understand what rejection felt like, on showing him that he couldn't just humiliate his father and walk away without consequences, that I hadn't considered what came after. I hadn't thought about what I wanted the outcome to actually be. Did I want him to suffer for the rest of his life? Did I want his marriage to fall apart because he was too stressed to make it work? Did I want to prove that I was smarter and stronger than him? Or did I want my son back? Because those were two very different goals, and only one of them would let me sleep at night and look myself in the mirror without shame. I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I thought about all the times he'd needed me and I'd been there, all the times he'd called and I'd answered, all the times I'd sacrificed something to help him, not because he deserved it, but because he was my son. I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be. Did I want to be the kind of man who would destroy his own child to prove a point? Did I want to be the kind of man who let his anger override his love? "You don't deserve my help," I said, and David flinched. "You're right, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, because that's what fathers do. We do things that aren't earned sometimes. We do them because we love our kids, even when they make us angry enough to burn down their entire lives, even when they hurt us more than we knew it was possible to be hurt." I turned back to face him. I was angry. I was so angry at you, and I wanted to hurt you the way you hurt me. But I realized something in the last few minutes. If I go through with this, if I let the wedding fall apart, if I make your life impossible, I don't win anything. I just lose my son. And that's a price I'm not willing to pay, no matter what he's done to me. I sat back down. Call them back in. When Rachel and her parents came back into the room, they could immediately sense the shift in the energy between David and me. Something fundamental had changed. David was standing now, not sitting as he had been, positioned next to me. Not behind me, but beside me, like we'd come to some kind of understanding, some kind of alliance. Rachel looked at him with confusion in her eyes, trying to read what had happened in the minutes they'd been gone. "I was wrong," David said, his voice steady now, looking directly at Rachel's father. "I was wrong to involve my father in this situation the way I did, and I was wrong to treat him the way I've been treating him. But he's offered to help us, with one condition." He glanced at me, and I nodded. He wants all of us in this room to understand something. This money is a gift, not a loan that we have to repay, not an investment with expectations of return, a gift. And gifts come with the expectation of gratitude, real gratitude. More than that, they come with the expectation that you understand someone chose to give you something you didn't deserve, something you didn't earn. They gave it because they love you, not because you've proven yourself worthy of it. Rachel's father's face was turning red, anger and embarrassment mixing together. "Your father just tried to sabotage your wedding," he said, his voice harsh. "He froze your accounts. He called off the venue. He threatened to investigate you for fraud. And now you're standing here accepting money from him like nothing happened, like he didn't just try to destroy your future." He looked at me with open contempt. "I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but this is manipulation. This is me choosing love over anger," I interrupted quietly. "Because that's what's happening. My son came in here and admitted he was wrong. He chose to be honest instead of continuing to live in a story where he's the victim and I'm the villain. He chose humility over pride, and because at the end of the day, I'm tired of being angry with him. I'd rather be his father again. I'd rather have my son than my revenge. I'd rather have my daughter-in-law in my life and know that my son's marriage is starting on a foundation of truth rather than bitterness." It took another hour of intense conversations, phone calls and arrangements, but the wedding was back on. Rachel's father, though still suspicious of my motives, couldn't really argue with the result. His daughter was getting married the next day. Rachel's mother was just relieved that everything was going to happen as planned. Rachel herself stood next to David, and I could see something shift in her too. A recognition that her husband was capable of growth, of admitting when he was wrong. When everyone was finally on board, I called my lawyer. I called my bank. I had the fraud hold removed, which took several phone calls and conversations with people in the fraud department who all wanted to understand why I was suddenly lifting the hold I'd so carefully put in place. I cleared the payments and made arrangements for the money to transfer to the Grandview's account the next morning. I made sure the money was there, that every detail was handled. I called Patricia at the Grandview to personally confirm everything was in order. She was professional as always, but I could hear the relief evident in her voice, that sense of crisis averted. "The wedding will proceed exactly as planned," I confirmed. "Everything will be paid in full tomorrow morning." When they all left my house that evening, Rachel's parents visibly exhausted. Rachel already texting people to confirm the wedding was still on, David lingered. He was standing in my doorway, silhouetted against the darkness outside. "I don't know how to repay you," he said, "for what you've done, for changing your mind, for giving me a chance when I didn't deserve one." "You don't have to repay me," I told him, "but there are things I expect. I expect you to build a life with your wife that's based on honesty instead of appearances. I expect you to call me sometimes without needing something from me. I expect you to be the kind of man who can admit when he's wrong, because that's actually rare, and that's actually admirable. I expect you to treat the people you love with the kind of respect and consideration you should have treated me with." He nodded, and then he hugged me. It was a real hug, not performative, not awkward. For the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back, not just the version of him that I saw on holidays or heard about through second-hand reports. The wedding went forward that Saturday afternoon, and it was beautiful in the way that weddings are when they're built on love rather than obligation or appearances. I attended as a guest, sitting near the back of the venue with Rachel's elderly grandmother, not in any place of honour or prominence. I didn't need a place of honour, I just needed to be there, to witness the beginning of his life with Rachel, to watch my son make his promises before God and all these people, to know that despite everything that had happened, despite the humiliation and the anger and the revenge I'd almost committed, we were still okay. We were still family. I watched David's face as he saw Rachel walk down the aisle. I watched the moment when he understood that this was actually happening, that all the chaos and panic and fear of the previous day had somehow resulted in this beautiful moment. There was tears in his eyes, and I felt my own eyes getting wet watching him. During the reception, after dinner but before the dancing really got started, David pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the ballroom. "I want you to know something," he said, "that Rachel and I have talked. We've talked about a lot of things over the last few days, about why we even got married in the first place, about what we actually want our life to look like, about whether we're building something meaningful together or just running from things separately because we're afraid of being alone." I waited, letting him continue. "We're going to try to make it work. Real work. Not just surface-level appearances and pretending everything is fine when it isn't. And I think part of that is going to involve me being closer to you. Not dependent on you, not using you as a fallback or a rescue plan, but actually close to you. Being your son in a real way, not just in name." That's all I needed to hear. I didn't need guarantees. I didn't need promises about the future or assurances that things would always be perfect between us. I just needed to know he was trying, that he understood what had happened and why it mattered, and that he wanted something different going forward. In the weeks after the wedding, things actually started to shift in meaningful ways. David called me on weekends, not because he needed something, but just to talk. We discussed life, business, relationships, all the things that fathers and sons are supposed to talk about. He asked my advice about the business situation, and I gave it honestly, including the hard truths about where he'd gone wrong and what he needed to do to fix it. He admitted over time and through various conversations that Rachel's parents had been putting pressure on him to set boundaries with me, that they'd convinced him that he needed to prove his independence by cutting me out, and instead of having an adult conversation with them about whether that was actually healthy or wise, he just accepted their framing with that question. We talked about his anger toward me, and I listened to him explain how my divorce from his mother had affected him more deeply than I'd realized at the time, how he'd felt abandoned, how he'd interpreted my moving on as a betrayal, how he'd carried that resentment for years without even fully understanding where it came from. I had opportunities to tell him he was wrong, to defend myself, to explain all the ways he'd misunderstood the situation and the circumstances, but mostly I just listened, because sometimes that's what people need. They need to know that someone will listen without immediately jumping to fix things or defend themselves or prove them wrong. They need to be heard. Rachel also softened over those weeks. She called me a week after the wedding, and her voice was humble and genuine in a way it had never been before. She apologized for pushing David to set those boundaries with me in the first place. "I thought I was helping him become independent," she said. "I thought I was protecting him from someone who might be too controlling or too involved in his life, but I was really just creating distance between you two, and I was making him choose between his father and his wife, and that's not fair to him. I'm sorry for that." I accepted her apology, and I even meant it when I told her that I understood what she was trying to do, that her intentions had been good even if the execution had been misguided and the results had been harmful. She and David started couples therapy not long after that, and David started individual therapy as well to work through some of his anger and his patterns of self-sabotage that had been showing up in multiple areas of his life. I didn't make these things happen. David did. He made the choice to seek help, to do the work, to address the underlying issues rather than just papering over them. But I think it was the moment I chose to help him anyway, despite everything he'd done that gave him permission to start making different choices, to believe that change was possible. But here's the thing that nobody talks about when it comes to revenge. The moment you decide to actually go through with it, the moment you put your plan into motion and watch it unfold in real time, you don't feel the triumph you thought you would feel. You don't feel victorious or vindicated. Instead, you just feel tired. Bone-deep tired. I felt the weight of what I'd done to my son, how close I'd come to actually destroying something important, something that could never be fully repaired even if I tried to undo the damage. I realized that if David hadn't come to me with that apology, if he'd walked out of my house that day when I gave him the ultimatum, our relationship might never have recovered. I might have gone through with the full sabotage. I might have made good on my threats to investigate the account for fraud, to make legal problems for him, to prove I was smarter and stronger, and that I would not be disrespected, and I would have won. Completely. I would have destroyed my son's wedding, and his marriage, and possibly his life, and I would have lost everything that actually mattered in the process. That's what I learned in those weeks and months after the wedding, that revenge is a luxury only the very rich or the very powerful can afford. The rest of us, ordinary people with ordinary lives and ordinary capacity for pain, we just end up poor and powerless in the aftermath of our own anger. I could have destroyed my son's wedding, I could have pursued it further, could have made his life hell, could have proved that I was the kind of man who would hurt his own child to prove a point. But what would have been the point? To feel better about myself for a few hours while my son suffered for years. That's not justice. That's just pathology. That's letting your wounds dictate your actions. The real victory came from choosing to forgive, choosing to extend grace, choosing to help despite everything he'd done. That's the choice that actually took courage, actual real courage. Revenge is easy. It's the path of least resistance. It's what you do when you're hurt and you want to hurt someone back, when you want them to feel even a fraction of what you're feeling. But healing, actual healing, that's hard. That requires you to look your son in the eye and see the pain behind the cruelty, to understand that he was struggling with things that had nothing to do with you, and to love him anyway. That's what I learned. That's what I'm still learning. The call came at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday. I was in my home office answering some emails, trying to stay productive in my newfound role as a man learning to live with his choices. When my phone buzzed, I didn't immediately recognise that it would change everything. The caller ID showed it was Patricia from the Grandview, the wedding venue. My first thought was that something had gone wrong with the final payment, some administrative hiccup that needed sorting. I had no idea that the entire carefully constructed resolution I'd spent weeks building was about to come crashing down in the most humiliating way possible. Patricia's voice was high and tight with controlled panic. "Mr. Hendricks, I need to inform you of a serious situation regarding your son's wedding scheduled for Saturday. The payment we received yesterday, the full $98,000, it's been reversed. The bank is showing it as a fraudulent charge. The venue is no longer available. We've had to move your son's date to the cancellation list, and I'm afraid the non-refundable deposit of $25,000 is forfeit." She paused, and I could hear her breathing, could imagine her sitting at her desk trying to figure out how to deliver the rest of the bad news. I set down my coffee carefully like it might shatter. There was a roaring sound in my ears, a rushing. Reversed. The payment that I had authorised, that I had instructed my bank to process after deciding to help my son despite everything he'd done, that I had spent all week arranging and verifying, it had been reversed. Fraudulent. As if I'd never made it at all. As if none of the conversations, none of the forgiveness, none of the work I'd done to overcome my anger had ever happened. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "Can you explain exactly what happened?" "All I know is that the charge appears to have been disputed. Our accounting department has been trying to reach both you and your son since early this morning. When we couldn't reach anyone, we had to assume the worst and begin cancellation procedures. The wedding is off. Saturday's venue is no longer available, and honestly, given the circumstances, I need to know if you want us to attempt to rebook at a different date, or if this is simply not going to happen." It took me several minutes to find my voice. "I'll handle this. I'll call you back within the hour." I hung up and sat very still. My hands were shaking. I spent the next 20 minutes navigating through automated systems, holding for a fraud specialist named Jennifer. She confirmed it. The charge had been disputed by the cardholder, which meant David had called and disputed the charge. My son, who I'd spent the last weeks trying to understand and forgive, had looked me in the eye, accepted my help, and then deliberately reversed the payment. The betrayal was staggering. It felt like stepping off a curb and finding there was no ground beneath you. I thanked Jennifer and hung up. I called David. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was defensive, almost preemptively apologetic. "Hey, Dad. What's up?" My voice came out cold, colder than it had been in weeks. "The wedding venue just called me. The payment was reversed. I want to know exactly what you did." There was a long pause and I could hear him breathing on the other end. "Oh God, Dad." That wasn't me. That was Rachel's father. He called me yesterday and said, if I had to run to you for help, then we weren't ready for this commitment. He said the only way to prove it was real was to make sure it was our money, our commitment, not a rescue from you controlling us. He used that word, control. He said you were probably using the money as a way to maintain influence over me and our marriage. I told him absolutely no. Yes, but he went behind my back. He disputed the charge before I could stop him. I've been trying to fix it all morning. My bank won't reverse the dispute without your authorization. You agreed to let him do this? You could have warned me. I could have stopped it before the venue even found out. I could have called you, David. He sounded like he was on the verge of tears. I'm so sorry, Dad. I don't know what to do. I feel like I've ruined everything again. I hung up without answering. What happened next occurred in a blur of phone calls and decision-making that felt simultaneously urgent and completely unreal. I called Patricia back and told her I was investigating unauthorized activity. She was sympathetic but firm. The cancellation had already begun. It would be complicated to reverse. I called my lawyer, Richard, who said this was legally complex. If I filed a fraud report but I'd authorized the payment originally, the bank might see this as a dispute between account holders, not actual fraud. I had to think very carefully about what I wanted to do. I called the bank back and got through to Marcus in fraud. I explained that the payment had been authorized by me but disputed by David without permission. I launched a formal fraud investigation. I was angry, hurt by what felt like another betrayal. I was playing both sides, my rage and love at war. By late afternoon, I'd been on the phone with 3 departments, my lawyer twice and Patricia again. The legal situation was murky. The financial situation was complicated. The emotional situation was catastrophic. And then, around 4 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find David and Rachel standing on my porch in the late afternoon light. I could see immediately that they'd been through something that had aged them both. Rachel's eyes were red and swollen from hours of crying. David looked like he hadn't slept. His hair was disheveled, his shirt untucked, wearing the same clothes I'd last seen him in. He looked defeated, like he was facing something genuinely impossible. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking on the single syllable. "I don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart again. Rachel's father is furious. He's saying the engagement is off unless I prove I'm serious by getting the money back in place by tomorrow. If I can't do it, he's cutting off all financial support to Rachel, including her health insurance. Her mother won. T even talked to him. Rachel's been crying all day. I don't have $98,000. I don't know where to get it. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." His words were tumbling out faster and faster, and I could see him on the verge of a complete breakdown. I just stood in the doorway, not moving, not speaking, feeling the full weight of the situation settle on me. This was the moment. This was the test of whether I'd actually learned anything from the previous weeks, from all that reflection on revenge and its costs. This was where I would either let my anger rule me or step back into being a father. I could have closed the door. I could have told him he'd made his choices. I could have said I wasn't going to be played for a fool again, but somehow the choice was already made. "Come in," I innerly said, stepping aside. "Come inside." We sat in my living room, and I laid out the only terms that made sense to me. The living room was the same room where we'd had that first real conversation after I'd decided to help him. The same room where the entire dynamic had started to shift. Now I was sitting across from him again, and something was different. I was different. I wasn't angrier this time, but I was clearer about what needed to happen. I could see the situation for what it actually was, and I could speak from a place of clarity instead of reaction. I told him to listen carefully, that I was going to say something that would be difficult, but that I needed him to hear it. First, David would call his father-in-law and set a clear boundary, not angrily, not in accusation, but clearly and firmly. He would explain that his decisions about his wedding, about his marriage, about his entire life would no longer be dictated by his in-laws' demands or judgments. He would tell Rachel's father that, while he respected his contributions to Rachel's life, the reversal of the payment was a violation of David's autonomy and his integrity. He would explain that if Rachel's father couldn't respect David's independence and his choices, then they would have to have minimal contact going forward. This had to be David's message, delivered by David, not negotiated or softened by Rachel or by me. Second, Rachel needed to understand that part of marrying David meant accepting his family, accepting me, and understanding that I was going to be in their lives. She couldn't use family obligation as a weapon in their relationship the way her father had tried to use it. Healthy families don't punish people for accepting help. They support people. They love them. They don't hold money over their heads. Third, and most important, I would help them again. I would reverse the fraud investigation and work with the bank to get the money back in place. I would make sure the venue was available and that the wedding could happen on Saturday. But there would be conditions. There would be no wedding until both David and Rachel sat down with me and explained what had happened from their perspectives, explained what they were thinking and feeling, and we had an honest conversation about boundaries and family and the difference between helping someone you love and enabling someone's poor choices. I couldn't help them if they weren't going to learn from this. If I was going to invest my money in their future, I needed to know they were actually learning something. that they understood the consequences of their actions and the choices they were making going forward. I could feel the weight of those terms landing on both of them. This wasn't a rescue. This was a reckoning. David looked at Rachel and she nodded. He called his father-in-law while I sat in the room with him. I could hear Rachel's father's voice coming through the phone, loud and angry and defensive. David had to say hard things, had to enforce boundaries he'd never enforced before, had to risk his father-in-law's anger and disappointment. His voice was shaky at first, actually breaking on some of the words. Then it got stronger. He told Rachel's father that his marriage wasn't negotiable, that it wasn't a commodity to be traded for approval or controlled through manipulation. He said that the reversal of the payment was a line that had been crossed. David wasn't going to let himself be manipulated anymore. If Rachel's father couldn't respect that boundary, if he couldn't accept David's independence and his choices, then they would have minimal contact moving forward. He said it clearly and calmly, without anger, which made it more powerful somehow. When he hung up, his hand was shaking, but his eyes were clear, resolved. Rachel made a similar call to her mother, which was harder in some ways because her mother was hurt rather than angry. Rachel had to explain that she loved her parents, but that she couldn't let them control her life through guilt and obligation. When she finished, she'd drawn her line too. They were choosing each other, choosing me, not because they needed something from me, but because they wanted a real relationship based on honesty and respect rather than manipulation. I spent the next 4 hours making phone calls. Once I got back to Marcus, he was willing to work with me. He understood that what had started as a real dispute was now being resolved. He walked me through formally withdrawing the fraud claim and reauthorizing the payment. It would take time, but he could flag it as urgent, make sure it was processed the next morning. I called Patricia and told her the payment was being reauthorized, that it would hit by 9 a.m., that the wedding was back on. She was relieved. She told me she would personally oversee the reinstatement. I called my lawyer and told him to cease all legal action. I made sure every domino I'd knocked down got put back in place. By the time evening settled into night, after David and Rachel had both made their phone calls and we'd eaten food from the Thai place down the street, we were sitting at my kitchen table having the conversation that mattered, the one that actually changed things. I asked them to explain what had happened. Not just the immediate situation with the payment reversal, but the patterns that had led to this point. Rachel went first. She admitted that her father had always been controlling, had always used money and leverage to maintain influence over her life, and that she'd been trained since childhood to view his demands as expressions of love. She said her parents' marriage was unhappy, and they'd seemed to project all of their unhappiness onto her engagement, making it feel like her wedding had to be this perfect thing to validate their own failures. She said she'd been so desperate for her father's approval that she'd been willing to hurt David to get it. She said that shamed her most, knowing she'd put her desire for her father's love ahead of her love for David. David admitted that he'd been unwilling to stand up to his father-in-law, that he'd let his insecurity about his financial situation make him vulnerable to manipulation. He said he'd been so desperate to prove he could provide for Rachel that when her father offered to help with money and connections, David had latched onto it as proof he'd finally succeeded at something, when really all he'd done was trade one form of dependence for another, swapping his father for his father-in-law in a different house. I told them both what I'd learned, or what I was trying to learn, about the difference between helping and controlling, about how sometimes the best thing you can do for the people you love is let them make their own choices, even when those choices hurt you deeply. I told them that I would always help them, but not in a way that required them to be grateful or indebted. Help means that I give something freely and then I let it go. The moment I expect anything in return, it stops being help. It becomes something else. It becomes a transaction. It becomes manipulation. It becomes a weapon. And I wasn't going to use my money or my knowledge as a weapon against my son, no matter what he'd done or how angry he'd made me. I said I understood why Rachel's father did what he did. Fear often expresses itself as control. People who are afraid of losing someone, who don't feel secure in their love, thus try to maintain that love through leverage and manipulation. It usually doesn't work. It usually has the opposite effect. It pushes people away. They heard me. I could see it in their faces, the recognition that something real had been said, something that actually mattered, something that was going to change how they thought about relationships and obligations and the nature of genuine love. The wedding happened on Saturday as planned. The sun was bright, the kind of bright that makes everything look hopeful and new. I attended and sat in the same back row I'd sat in before, next to Rachel's elderly grandmother, a woman in her mid-80s who had no idea about any of the drama and just enjoyed the ceremony, the cake, the music. She grabbed my hand during the vows. I watched David marry the woman he loved, watched him stand at the altar, and watched Rachel walk down the aisle toward him. This time, when I saw the tears on his face, I understood them differently. This wasn't just emotion about the moment. This was gratitude that the moment was happening at all, that his choices and his growth had resulted in this beautiful thing. There was a humility in his tears that hadn't been there, here before. The reception was quieter than it would have been, less pressurized by external expectations, more genuinely joyful. David and Rachel danced, and they looked happy in a way that seemed real, not performed. They moved together like they understood that marriage is a choice you have to make every single day, not just once at the altar. Later, near the end of the reception, when people were starting to leave and the cleaning crew was already moving chairs, Rachel's father approached me. He was stiff, uncomfortable, clearly struggling with something he'd been preparing to say. He told me that Rachel had called him the morning of the wedding and told him what I'd said about helping versus controlling, about the difference between love and manipulation. He said he'd been thinking about that conversation a lot over the past week, about how he'd spent decades controlling his children instead of just loving them, and that his marriage had suffered because of it. His wife had probably resented him for it, even though they'd never explicitly discussed it. He said he was starting to understand that his need to control everything came from his own fear, from his own insecurity about whether people would stay if he wasn't managing everything. He apologized for what he'd done, for reversing the payment without consulting David, for putting David in an impossible position. He said he'd been trying to force David to prove himself to Rachel's father by denying him access to help from me, and that he realized now how destructive that was. I accepted his apology, not because it said what had happened, but because he seemed to genuinely understand what he'd done and why it was wrong. I told him that I thought David was lucky to have a father who could admit when he'd made a mistake. I said that if he was willing to do the work, to look at his own patterns and his own fears, they could rebuild their relationship on healthier ground. I meant it. He nodded, and then he extended his hand, and I shook it. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning. It was a willingness on both sides to try something different, to acknowledge the damage without letting it define the relationship forever. In the months that followed, the wedding wasn't the end of the story. It was the actual beginning of something real. David and Rachel worked with a couples counselor not because their marriage was in trouble, but because they wanted to make sure they were building something strong and real from the start, something based on honest communication instead of assumptions. Rachel took some space from her father, not to punish him, but to establish boundaries that would make a future relationship possible. She saw him once a month instead of weekly. She started saying no to his suggestions and his input. Slowly, he started to understand that his daughter would choose to have him in her life more if he gave her the space to make that choice. David and I found a rhythm where we saw each other without either of us being in crisis or needing something. We had coffee on Sunday mornings sometimes. We called each other just to talk about nothing in particular. We actually became friends, not just father and son, which is a different thing entirely and so much better. I realized that the moment I decided to help David anyway, despite his betrayal and despite my anger, I'd also decided something fundamental about the kind of man I wanted to be. I'd decided that I would rather be a man capable of forgiveness than a man bent on revenge. I'd decided that my anger was less important than my love, and once you make that decision consciously, deliberately, knowing the cost of it, you can't go back. You're bound to it. You have to live up to it every single day, and some days are harder than theirs. Some days I want to throw it in his face, remind him of what he did, make him understand the extent of my sacrifice, but I don't. Because the moment I do that, I stop giving help and start demanding payment. I become the kind of man who uses love as currency. That's not who I want to be. So I keep choosing forgiveness, day after day, choice after choice, moment after moment. My son said I didn't get invited to the wedding and that I wasn't paying for anything. I smiled. And then I paid anyway, not because he deserved it, not because I owed it to him, but because I'd decided that love means giving people what they need, not what they've earned. Sometimes what people need most isn't money or rescue or validation. It's knowing that someone believes in them anyway, even after they've failed. even after they've hurt you deeply. It's knowing that someone won't keep score. That's the only gift that actually matters. That's the only thing that changes people. The wedding happened, the marriage is happening, life is happening. And I'm still here, still learning what it means to forgive, to help, to love without keeping score. That's everything. That's all any of us really need.